There I was, minding my black business, researching, writing, and looking up words to mispronounce when a new comment floated across my dashboard. I don't see every comment, but I saw this one and it made me laugh. After buttering me up with all kinds of compliments, this fellow said, "Her great intellect is not being used for the betterment of the black community. The sexual issues in the black community is a serious and monumental problem. I wish that Alexis would use her great intelligence to help deal with this enormous problem. The sexual issues in the black community lead to early and unprotected sex, resulting in unwanted births in too many single girl households." How could I deny the call to strap on my cape and tackle this issue? After all, I'm a historian, and that's what we do, fix problems. It's a frequent sentiment in my comments that the black community is falling apart because of single mothers, and that feminism and no good little internet sluts like me are the culprits. As this commenter observed and implied, my extensively researched essays about US and black history aren't enough for the betterment of the black community. I need to step my pussy up and destroy centuries of issues while begging the 25 to 35% of men with multiple children by multiple women to put their dicks back in the holsters or maybe just get vasectomies. It's me, the historian's job, to help everybody heal from their generational traumas, trust issues, and negative experiences. And I get it. It's hard out here, but the black community wants love, even if it acts like it doesn't. 47% of black American adults report being single, higher than any other racial and ethnic groups. And roughly the same amount of black adults report listening to podcasts, with 57% of them tuning into shows about relationships, topping other races. The commenter wanted me to tackle this great problem of sexual issues, but there is no discussing black sex without black love, and neither topic can be really dug into without black history. For Black Love Day and Valentine's Day, and also Black History Month, how about we look at the evolution of black love and sex from a real point of view? Black love comes in a bunch of forms, but if your idea of black love includes sex, I've got a treat for you. And yes, I'm talking about solo sex, couple sex, and even group sex. Spice up whatever plans you have for Valentine's Day and beyond with Beducated. With over 100 courses to choose from, whatever type of love you're celebrating can be taken to the next level. If we didn't have sex, we wouldn't have history. So say thanks to sex and to Beducated. Thank you, sex. Thank you, Beducated. There's lessons on oral, fingering, anal, G-spots, and more. And not to drag anybody, but if you haven't had sex without penetration in a while, you need to check out Sex Experiments for Couples. Some of my favorite courses include the conversations that make sex even more fulfilling, like the Wheel of Consent, Navigating Sex Drive Mismatch, and Open Relationships. Speaking of relationships, if you're single this Valentine's Day, Beducated has courses on navigating the online dating space and masturbation if you don't want to be bothered. When you use the link in my box and my code Alexis, you get 50% off the yearly pass. The 14-day money-back guarantee makes the choice an easy one. But if you want to test the waters, you can try out Beducated for 24 hours free. Let Beducated amp up not just your Valentine's Day, but your whole damn love life. Don't hesitate to click the link in my description box below. Now, let's get to the history. Antebellum period, black people, free or in bondage, forged relationships, fell in love, and got married within and outside the confines of white laws and acceptance. On plantations where marriages weren't recognized, couples jumped the broom, women decorated and primped themselves, and people celebrated. When couples were sold away from each other or lived apart to begin with, they traveled. In the aftermath of the Civil War, there were thousands of people looking for lost partners and spouses, and millions more looking for family. Some people, because they had moved around so much and never thought they'd see somebody again, had multiple spouses. Marriage was extremely important after slavery, and yes, it often involved love and was a centerpiece of Christianity, but it was also an important component of being accepted into and competing with white patriarchal supremacy. Black men needed black women and vice versa to have children, continue the race, work the land, and survive. And also, if you're having raw sex, and in high likelihood in the late 19th century you are, it's a good idea to marry the knucklehead who got you pregnant, right? From the 1890s until the 1960s, black people had a higher marriage rate than white Americans. But were those marriages different? What happened during those years, and what changed after? What historical variables were impacting the black marriage rate? For starters, those were the years of nadir and Jim Crow in the South, when lynching was a frequent occurrence to stamp out political activity and dissuade interracial mixing. Black men were propagandized as rapist brutes, routinely rounded up for petty reasons and shipped off to prison farms. Plenty of black boys were sent to reformatories where they were essentially imprisoned for their labor. Allegations of sexual delinquency by black girls led to reformatories that could turn wayward black girls into good and moral workers and future wives, championed by black club women like Charlotte Hawkins Brown. And these reformatories popped up from the 1920s through 40s. Also in the black community during this time, the black church was rising in power, and its middle and upper class founding fathers and mothers had spent the 1890s through 1920s repressing black sexual expression to prevent stereotypes, aka respectability politics. Also from 1910 to 1970, approximately 6 million black people moved from the South, in part to flee the lynching and imprisonment I just described, in search of new opportunities. Most ended up in New York, Chicago, and LA, where new dating rituals for all races were unfolding. There were recreational dance halls for various racial groups where people went to drink and socialize. Like they would be 100 years later, how black women survived in this new dating market was criticized much more viciously than their peers. The good black woman versus the bad black woman was ensnared in class and colorism. Wrote social worker Elsie Johnson McDougald in defense of black women in 1924, "The Negro does not maintain any moral standard which may be assigned chiefly to qualities of race, any more than a white woman does. Yet she has been singled out and advertised as having lower standards. Superficial critics who have had contact only with lower grades of Negro women claim they are more immoral than other groups of women. This I deny." Grumblings about the marriageable worthiness of low-grade black women grew in prominence due to the Jezebel propaganda, the new dating market of the era happening amid women's suffrage and feminism, the consumption of products for dating rituals, think flowers, chocolates, and jewelry, and cues about romance in the newly emerging film genre. In urban areas, dating costs money now. It meant experiences. Poor men of all colors, but especially black men who were disproportionately underpaid and unemployed, were often competing for the affections of women who could or did make their own money. By 1924, at least 2 million black women worked in domestic, agricultural, and manufacturing positions. This wasn't a feminist action either. It was about survival, as it remains over 90 years later. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The more progressive attitudes and newfound anonymity of city life during the Roaring '20s meant a greater divergence of the possibilities of romance. Yes, there were more interracial relationships in the 20s and 30s than previous decades, a trend that would grow in every decade after, changing the dating pool forever, but let's stick to black love. During the Harlem Renaissance and in similar scenes in Chicago and LA, black queer love was common. Singer Mabel Hampton described lesbian parties with buffet tables and 12 or 14 women where you buy your drinks and have fun. She later described a black lesbian wedding ordained by a gay minister in 1938. Black love was evolving, but during this time period, marriage continued to be prioritized, even if it meant cheating, suppressing your sexual desires, hidden families, abuse, or plain old incompatibility. People stayed together, even if they weren't happy, especially in the South. In 1941's Growing Up in the Black Belt by Charles S. Johnson found that of the 916 families studied, women headed less than 1 in 5 of them. And this was in the aftermath of the Great Depression, which devastated family incomes and strained relationships. But the people stayed together. And the love quarrels and woes that would happen in these relationships are documented extensively in every music scene, from blues to Motown to R&B to hip hop. And we all have those stories, you know, those family tales, friends. We could all spend at least an hour listing out stories of spouses doing each other dirty and staying together. And, you know, we could dive again into black femicide as I did in this video, but you get the point. As people cry today, couples back then really did stay together. And this is why dating, and especially marriage, was hard. It was work. In 1940, about 60% of women were married, regardless of race. And that's a majority, but that's also a hell of a lot of unmarried women. And by 1946, 1 in 3 of all marriages was ending in divorce. And just like now, where people turn on podcasts for advice from random couples or get bogged down in daily social media discussions about $200 dates, relationship hypotheticals, and celebrity relationship drama, numerous examples from the 20th century show that there's always been dating anxiety and chatter. In the widely circulated Chicago Defender, a vaudeville mind reader performer named Voluta Hill Straughter wrote under the name Princess Mysteria and advised black women to be respectable and get married, but also to get their education and their money. She also told them not to put up with bullshit, telling one woman who had recently become paraplegic, despairing over her perfect gentleman with a drinking problem, "Your intended husband is wrong to show a weakness for alcohol. A drunkard will not make a husband for any woman. You have lost enough. Don't lose all." But at the same time, when a 22-year-old girl wrote into Princess Mysteria in 1924 and confessed that she doesn't want to get married and asked for advice on how to make herself desire marriage instead of her best friend, wrote Princess, "All normal girls are interested in boys, and the fact that you are not classes you with those who are not normal. For your own peace and security, I advise you to try and cultivate the association of nice boys, as you may someday regret it if you do not." I wonder if that reader suppressed her sexual desires and got married because of community pressures, or if she just said fuck it and went on and, started dating women. In the Virginia Journal and Guide from the 1920s to 40s, a mysterious Naomi gave dating and marriage advice to black women. The paper had a circulation of over 100,000 during World War II, when it was reported that 32% of black wives worked outside of the home, compared to 14% of white wives. This is important to note because if you haven't noticed yet, the economy is entangled in the story of black love. Most of the million black men who served in World War II and their families were not given what they were owed in the country's huge affirmative action program, the GI Bill. Poor white families and their children joined the middle class, widening the wealth gap for generations to come. White children soaked up all of the benefits that incentivized and accommodated marriage goals, while the black poverty rate would worsen and even more black women entered the workplace. So in the 1940s, according to archivist Christina Simmons, who compiled the columns for Naomi, her main instructions for black women in the News and Journal were to be kind, not waste money, not nag, and be accommodating to men's needs. The basics were for the man to provide financial support and not be abusive, for which a wife should be grateful. Bam, the bar always been on the floor, child. Everything else she instructed black women to deal with. And a common complaint was women losing their independence after marriage while men left to go cheat or hang out with friends. Naomi instructed them to be patient and pray, common refrains from the black church, and another important aspect of black marriage rates, love, and sex, because black women are more likely than men to go to church. So what else was happening to the black marriage rate? More changes included the budding new age group, teenagers. Whereas their grandparents and parents were working and getting married at the same age, black teens were increasingly going to school. There were proms, the kids went steady, there was a new car culture. And they, like everybody else, were also the recipients of new mass media like Pulp Fiction, romance adventure magazines, and movies that outline the performance of romance and the road to marriage. Everybody's views on what a marriage should be composed of was changing during this era. Between 1936 and 1942, a mostly black group of researchers produced 5 studies on black youth trends summarized by Susan Kahn in Sexual Reckonings, Southern Girls in a Troubling Age. The spectrum of black girls' and boys' sexual activity and views was as varied as it is now, with some being pro-sex and others being completely uninterested. Like modern girls, they witnessed the relationships of their parents and in the communities around them. Marriage meant sex meant children, with little to no control or family planning, a contributor to the wedge issue that continues to be birth control and abortion. For some of these girls, the 20th century version of ghosting was their biggest fear. It could mean falling in love or getting pregnant and a man leaving because he didn't want to take care of the baby and you couldn't track him down, or the man leaving to take care of the baby via seasonal migrant labor and he ended up being imprisoned or murdered, never to be heard from again. This was the risk, especially for poor black women. The 20th century studies also showed a troubling lack of consent and attention paid to age, two things that have only improved in the modern era and have no doubt again changed marriage rates. Think of the older black women and even men in your family or showbiz who are married under 18 to people much older than them. There are plenty of stories like that. And thus, as the century went on, views on marriage were changing, summed up by a 14-year-old named Sadie Barnes in North Carolina in the 40s. I don't want to lose my pleasure, my freedom. I don't want anyone to boss me. And just like modern conversations about what men should do to apply pressure in heterosexual relationships, teen girls of the 1940s, many of them poor and the children of farmers, dreamed of things at the time that were not statistically possible. They longed most often for one of two things. The first, many dreamed of marrying a doctor, businessman, or other professional who would provide a nice house and wardrobe, limit family size, and whose income would enable her to remain or at least not work too hard. It was giving soft life or trad wife, if you will. And if they couldn't get that, what did these black girls want? Securing a job that guaranteed a good income, mobility, and independence. So what does this mean? The girlies of the 30s, 40s, and beyond were asking for either a good marriage modeled after white patriarchy and capitalism, or the ability to survive in the same system of white patriarchy and capitalism independently if no man could provide security for them. Damn, that sounds familiar. Black love would still sprout, blossom, and grow in the mid-20th century, but by the 1960s, it was being tied less frequently to marriage. Sometimes this was by force, like in the case of government housing and welfare benefits, where cities or state service administrators demanded that black women be single and live without men in the house to receive benefits. This was psychologically destructive and impactful, and even used as a plot device in 1974's Claudine, starring Diahann, Carroll, and James Earl Jones. But it wasn't the sole reason for weakening marriage rates. The benefits of the GI Bill for white men were really glowing up by the 60s, who were able to find cheap housing, earn enough to keep often unhappy wives at home, and vote for laws that benefited them and their progeny. During this same decade, black love was modeled and promoted by the iconic relationships of civil rights leaders and celebrities in black media. While Jet Magazine reported on black love stories as much as it spilled gossip and blind item tea about failing black relationships, many media outlets made a more conscious effort to promote only positive black love stories, especially after 1965's Moynihan Report. The romance of Martin Luther King Jr. and Coretta, so powerful that decades later it evidently inspired Jonathan Majors to demand his white girlfriend to model herself after the music lover and activist, was a major story in black press in the 50s and 60s. They announced plans to marry on Valentine's Day 1953 in the Atlanta Daily World, and their marriage in June was covered widely. They were just one of several public black couples whose romance and family life would be touted as the model for black love, crucially during a time when not only were black men and women grappling with years of being propagandized in mainstream media as undesirable and unlovable, but also when interracial dating was normalized and legalized. This is why it's especially telling that the FBI attempted to undermine the relationship of Martin Luther King and Coretta and spread slander about cheating. So depictions of black love and marriage, despite the falling rates of marriage, grew in the 70s and beyond, particularly in advertisements. At the same time, black queer love also became more common than it had in previous decades. And even if those couples didn't get married, there were more women and men than ever before who abstained from pretending to be straight. Less and less black people were marrying for the reason their ancestors did nearly 100 years previously, to survive. A 1981 Ebony article by Lerone Bennett Jr., which would be republished multiple times over the years, detailed the history of black love, pointing out that in American soil, it was a love tried by terror and bloodshed, beginning as what might have been a shipboard romance. For our ancestors, who modern people point to whenever they ask why marriage rates are so low, marriage was a tool of survival. The concept of black love that we now know, so often a representational slogan, was not the reality of black love prior to the late 20th century. Love happened, of course, but within the circumstances of necessity. Barnett continued that by the 1980s, black love was more than just men and women marrying. It is the ribald knowing, terrifying, signifying circle of brothers at the barbershop. It is the total commitment some blacks and organizations give to the community, he wrote, before listing out the ways in which black love is manifested outside of marriage. This was a growing sentiment, but the increase of single mother homes during the 80s was the real meat of the issue. It was the culprit, according to leaders and people like the commenter at the top of this video, that weakened marriage rates. According to Alexandra Odom in her 2019 dissertation, Ebony Magazine emphasized black love in the 80s by running a myriad of expert-backed articles on how to date and giving marriage advice, and representing black love in advertisements. At the time, black women outnumbered black men by 1 million, and there were approximately 43 marriageable black men for every 100 black women. Many of these articles minimize the shortage, but as discussed in Lectual Does the 80s, black women, who were making more money than in previous decades, were becoming choosier or coming out of the closet, while black men were also becoming choosier, dating out, being mass incarcerated, and coming out of the closet and more. This made and would make black love harder, especially again because of the economy. As romance culture continued to bloom in mass media, outlining the laws of dating, buy this, buy that, it melded with traditional patriarchal norms about what it takes to be married. Numerous studies show that when men of all races make less money or are unemployed, they are less likely to pursue marriage. And when they feel emasculated because of toxic ancient pressures, at best they become emotionally distant, aka uncuffable, and at worst, they become violent. This matters when people ask why black women choose to be single and why the marriage rate is so low. Not only are black women incapable of forcing any man to be in a relationship, but all relationships aren't healthy. Additionally, reproductive coercion, aka what happened to the condom, and Nick Cannon wannabes aside, single-parent homes continue to be overwhelmingly manufactured by the growing wealth gap, a lack of meaningful sex education, and restricted access to family planning services. Women don't impregnate themselves, booze. All three of those things I just mentioned have worsened in the past 30 years, impeding and delaying black love stories and the marriage rate. Black love in the 90s gets its own deep dive in Lectual Does the 90s, but walk with me. When you mix in other huge variables like interracial relationships, colorism, unhealed sexual and physical abuse that we're just now beginning to take seriously, a backlash to and rejection of feminism in favor of traditional values, it's easy to see why black love has suffered and why marriage rates, down for all races, have fallen. If recent studies revealing ideological rifts between men and women are to be believed, things aren't looking too good. Incels intimidated by women of all stripes seek to diminish them, humble them, or worse. In return, women with recurring dating issues become jaded and untrusting, transactional and cold to protect themselves from further heartbreak, encouraging more misogynoir and mistrust in a vicious cycle where none of us, no matter the gender, want to go viral for looking stupid in a relationship online. At the same time, black celebrity relationships become idealized, picked apart, vulnerable, and projected on in vicious cycles, generating new discourse and animosity, first in gossip columns and magazines in the mid-20th century, but now on social media and in podcasts by people who don't give a fuck about context and just care about numbers, to the detriment of black love. And I get it. It's understandable to see why relationship media and podcasts and discourse is prevalent. On one hand, we're humans and we love sex, and those things are often about sex. But also, as the wealth gap worsens, the gender ideological gap widens, and the population shifts into a larger proportion of immigrants, Latinos, and mixed race people, the general black community is anxious about our survival, which has always rested on black mating and population numbers. It's the same reason 4 black grandparent jokes and FBA discussions have moved to the forefront of black American identity online. The relationship anxieties are an extension of anxieties over the black American crisis of maintaining the limited power we've achieved in this country so far. We're 13% of the population, but for how much longer? The solution for some people is for Black Americans to return to the old days of marrying and staying together, no matter the circumstances, to continue the race and end what they deem to be degeneracy. To them, Black love is specifically straight, specifically monogamous, specifically defined by the piece of paper that grants employment, insurance, Social Security, and tax benefits in a capitalist society, because as I'll remind you at every turn, most Black people are not communist or anti-capitalist. Meanwhile, the serious problems like abuse and reproductive coercion and the damage of the capitalist economy get swept under the rug to deify Black love, at the expense of Black love. I regularly get comments from people who call me and other Black women bedwenches for acknowledging the difficulty of dating as a modern Black woman, and others who call me a mule/pick-me because I dare to acknowledge the white supremacist system that propagates these cycles and because I still date Black men. But all of you can go f yourselves. And don't forget, Beducated would love to help with that. Use my code Alexis for 50% off the annual pass. In this brief ranting history of Black love, I've summed up how relationships, dating, and marriage have changed alongside major historical events and attitudes. While marriage rates are lower among our community, when we get married, we do marry Black. In 2017, 82% of the new Black marriages were between two Black people. Now, what was the point of all of this? It's impossible to address the marriage rate and single mother stats that people hold dear without the history of all the shit I talk about on this channel. And as the condescending commenter at the top of this video said, I wish that Alexis would use her great intelligence to help deal with this enormous problem. As demonstrated, the problem of a fallen marriage rate is a multi-headed beast that I refuse to be held responsible for. It's a sign of economic imbalance in a racist capitalist system, as well as a rebuke of the confines of patriarchy. And while on a personal level, I love Black love, and I love weddings. Hello, cake, alcohol, dancing, crying? Invite me. But I'm just a girl. Maybe this commenter dreams of me starting and surviving the revolution that would end economic, racial, and gender inequity by convincing a bunch of people to give up their stuff and religions. Or creating and getting into a time machine to assassinate a bunch of people and ensure reparations after the Civil War. Or maybe they want me to change my present career to blackmailing or paying men of all races to get vasectomies if they don't want children and encouraging Black women to settle. I'm not doing any of that shit. Everybody needs therapy, baby, and this is a history channel. My way of dealing with any problem is and continues to be getting to the history. The next time somebody whines about the marriage rates or why Black couples don't stay together like they used to, point them to this video. Happy Valentine's Day, babes! And thanks for watching this rant. And thank you to Beducated for supporting my exploration of sex history.